Episode 3 of The Acolyte was great, but they've also revealed enough of the plot that they've activated my Star Wars historian senses where I know enough and I'm like, oh, it's a bit of Dathomiri, but also it's a bit of the Legacy of the Force stuff, but also it's kind of similar to some of the reveals from Ahsoka, but also the scenario they're presenting is almost classic Jedi Apprentice, and just a million spiraling thoughts like that. So I've almost defeated my enjoyment of the show in the now endless cocoon of possible options that I'm now involuntarily considering. This episode was a flashback. It was flashing back to the main character's childhood and explaining some of the context for the current mystery and how the characters are feeling the way they feel. It's the kind of flashback that works very well with the kind of mystery-based in character that they're doing. And it's got an interesting master-Padawan relationship at the core of it, tying it all together, which I find myself endlessly compelled by. And it's doing some interesting things with the Force and other characters' perceptions of the Force. That once again, it kind of reminds me of the old comics and books and stuff where they just open the idea of what the Force is and how people perceive it and map it onto different versions of spirituality from the real world. And it's a little different, and maybe it's not the coolest conceivable way to look at the Force, but it's interesting and it's new, and that's what I expected it to be, so I'm happy. I will say, I think maybe the character beats could have been a bit more clearly articulated. Like, there was some characterization that was kind of unclear, and they didn't necessarily do the greatest job of getting me invested in the character bonds. This episode was a lot about the conflict between the Jedi group and another group, but it didn't really do a great job of establishing how the Jedi were the good guys. We didn't get a clear morality from them, and we didn't get a clear idea that, say, in the context we were seeing, which is in the question of whether they want to take a child to train as a Jedi, why that was actually a conventionally good option. Because this is kind of sticky territory in Star Wars stories. The Phantom Menace in 1999 built the policy that children beyond a certain age couldn't be taken to be trained as Jedi, with the inverse implication that the younger the child, the better. And from there, perhaps even infants were the ideal Jedi candidates. But that introduces all sorts of ethical questions, and when you're a 5-year-old watching it, you don't really care about that. But if you really start diving into that plot point, you need to think it through in an intelligent way. And some expanded universe material did do this, like the Jedi Apprentice series, which I think has the most in-depth exploration of that process beginning to end. And the conclusion that series reaches more than once, in various scenarios, is that it's impossible to really do that. Because besides even sidestepping the question of how ethical it is to take a child and allege you're not going to let their parents see it, and the questions of child care and child nurturing and stuff like that, that surely must be met. In this sci-fi world, some Jedi come from poor families who can't really get in touch with them again, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are from wealthy or at least stable families. And if the family comes to Coruscant and wants to see their kid, the Jedi can't just stop them from seeing their kid. The picture of the prequel-era Jedi established in the Jedi Apprentice series, granted in a series aimed at 5 to 13-year-olds, but is the whole franchise not aimed at 5 to 13-year-olds in a way? Is that they are constantly fighting what is essentially a rearguard action against the no attachments rule, because in practice it is impossible to implement. And indeed, the very nature of Jedi and the Force, that they can draw power from their feelings, works against the idea of losing attachments, since attachments are what entail a lot of our intense feelings a lot of the time. And you could argue that we see a mature fulfilling of that idea in the original trilogy, because Luke Skywalker's character is someone who is redeemed and succeeds because of his feelings and because of his attachments to his friends, and then his attachment in a way to his father. And the Jedi Order he establishes in the expanded material after the movies is one that is fine with families, but just understands the complexity of having power fueled by feelings, but also still understands the obligation to be responsible with your power regardless. And plenty of other Star Wars publications understood this, and I guess it's a little baffling to me that this entry doesn't quite understand it. But oh well, it doesn't necessarily matter. With the way this episode was structured, it really reminded me, they're really making this for the binge experience. They're just giving it piecemeal. And this was kind of a table-setting episode where they set up some character stuff and some stuff that's going to pay off later, but they didn't have any big fights and they didn't have any big reveals, and maybe just by nature of what it is, it has to be one of the more boring episodes and doesn't reflect the quality of the entire show. So I'm going to keep watching it, and I'm excited to see what happens next.